I want to invite Ms. Gret van Eerschot, who's the Secretary General of Pax Christi International, Marie and Bishop Dowling forward, and with Phil Worthington, who's Managing Director of the European Lawyers in Lesvos, to receive the award. So. And now we're going to hear a word from Phil Worthington.
Well, I'm delighted that the most stressful part of the evening is over, which is the fact I didn't drop the prize. So, first of all, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's come this evening, and of course, in particular, thank you to Pax Christi International co-president, Bishop Dowling and Ms. Dennis, to the Pax Christi Secretary General, Ms. van Eerschot, and to Judy Coder as well. I am delighted and honoured to accept this prize on behalf of European Lawyers in Lesvos. Part of me feels like it shouldn't be me up here accepting this, because really the work of European Lawyers in Lesvos is done by our staff, our Greek lawyers, and our volunteers who come give up their Is that okay? And our volunteers who give up their holiday or take unpaid leave to come and volunteer in Lesvos. When I received the email to say that we've been awarded this prize, it made me think back to the beginning of European Lawyers in Lesvos and the context at that time in early 2016, and to think about what has changed between that time and today. And as Bishop Dowling mentioned and touched upon, there has been, I think, a chilling effect in Europe since that time. In 2015 and 2016, as I'm sure everybody remembers, Europe faced the biggest influx of refugees and migrants since World War II, with more than 1.8 million arrivals since 2015 and 1 million in 2015 alone. The situation then was one of open borders. People could arrive in Lesvos or the other Greek islands and transit through to the northern European countries if they wished. And more than 1 million people transited to Germany as part of Chancellor Merkel's open door policy. There was great media attention on the situation. I remember when I first arrived in Lesvos, every single day on the harbour front there was a news crew from across Europe. There was great interest in the issue. And then there was the EU-Turkey deal in March 2016. And I think for many people that was it's kind of the closing of the initial period of welcoming refugees. And for many people that represented the end of the issue. That this was seen as a kind of solution to the issue of people arriving. And of course it did have one of the aimed effects, which was to reduce the number of people arriving very, very significantly. And my understanding is that is how it's perceived, certainly in political terms and also in the popular consciousness. The issue is, though, is that the effect of that was to fundamentally change the situation and, in terms of human rights, to change it for the worse. Now the situation is, rather than transiting through the island, people now must stay on Lesvos. They're under a geographical restriction. They're required to apply for asylum in Greece. So now everybody remains in Greece, usually in Lesvos, to have their asylum case heard. And it was in that context, after the EU-Turkey deal, that European Lawyers in Lesvos was established. And the genus of the project came from the CCBE and the German Bar Association, who identified that in this situation there was a great need for lawyers, because actually the asylum process is a legal process, and everybody who is going through the asylum process is going through a legal process. And I've often reflected upon this, that people have lawyers for so many things in life. If you're buying a house, you'll have a lawyer. If you're going to sign an employment contract, you might want a lawyer to look at it. Yet, here, in this situation for asylum seekers, who, for some people, it may potentially be a matter of life and death, there is an expectation that there won't be any lawyers, and very few lawyers provided by the state, for example. And it was in this context that the CCB and the German Bar Association established European Lawyers in Lesvos, and I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank those two organisations, the CCB, who I'm delighted to say are represented here by the President de Freitas, and the Vice Presidents, and their Secretary General, Philip Busseri, and also the German Bar Association, who are also represented by a delegation here. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Claude Bruggemann, who was at the time the Chief Executive of the German Bar Association. He was really a driving force behind European Lawyers in Lesvos, and has remained a very valuable advisor ever since. It was in the context of just immediately after the EU-Turkey deal that European Lawyers in Lesvos began operation. So in July 2016, we welcomed our first volunteers. Since then, we have grown. We've gone from being a relatively small organisation to now a charity registered in Germany. And fundamentally, what we do is we have a team of Greek lawyers and a team of volunteer European asylum lawyers, who together provide free, independent legal assistance to asylum seekers on Lesvos, and particularly in Moria camp. And it's not really possible, I think, to talk about Lesvos without talking a little bit about the situation in Moria. There are currently about, just over 7,000 asylum seekers on the island, 5,500 of whom live in Moria camp. And Moria camp, which you may remember from last year, was called by MSF the worst refugee camp on earth. There are, the capacity of Moria is only 3,100, so it's almost double capacity, and half of the people living in the camp are either women or children, and including over 400 unaccompanied minors, some of whom have lived there for months. This, as I will touch upon many times, is not it's not an issue that has been solved. It's not an issue that we can forget about, because in June 2019 alone, 1,216 people have arrived into Moria, all of whom will go through the asylum process. So, set up in that situation, the fundamental idea behind European Lawyers in Lesvos is that we believe that unhindered access to independent legal assistance from a lawyer is a fundamental right, and vital to protecting human rights and upholding the rule of law. It's our mission on Lesvos to provide this. It's particularly pertinent for people, for asylum seekers generally, to have access to legal assistance, but particularly in Greece, because as the volunteers, many of whom I'm delighted to say are here tonight, will attest, the asylum process is a very complex one, and one that changes all the time. And that need, and that the need to provide legal assistance, and also the knowledge that there was and there remains a movement of solidarity within Europe and within the legal community in Europe to provide pro bono legal assistance, was what drove the project in its early days, and continues to do so. And you may wonder, you may ask, why is it that lawyers are needed in this situation? Because maybe things like housing, food, wash, access to water are the more obvious needs, and of course they are very important too. But as I mentioned, the legal process, the asylum process in Lesvos is a legal process. It's a very complex and ever-changing process. There are no lawyers provided by the state, particularly at the first instance stage, so before somebody's asylum interview, but actually even at the appeal stage as well, even though there is a legal obligation for the Greek state to provide lawyers at the appeal stage. For more than a year, there has been no lawyers in Lesvos providing legal assistance to people at the appeal stage. Without access to legal assistance, asylum seekers don't know their rights, or in many cases don't know their rights. They don't necessarily understand the process they're going through, and critically they don't understand the criteria that they will have to meet in order to be granted refugee status. And this, I think, is something that is very important, because there is limited information provided by the authorities in Moria when people arrive. They're given a brief information session, but in many cases people don't really understand the process they're going through, so they don't know their rights, so they can't realise and uphold their rights, and they don't understand the process they're going through. And in many cases this leads people to think that the process is simply an administrative one. People receive their information in the most part from the smugglers, who of course don't necessarily give an accurate picture of the process people are going through. That leads people to also not seek out legal assistance because they don't know that it's necessary. Because of this, the majority of people will go to their interview without ever having spoken to a lawyer. And just maybe to give you an example, to put this into concrete terms, just after we'd begun work, I was in the camp and I was talking to somebody who had already done his interview, so he was waiting for his decision. And I asked him, I said, well, how did the interview go? And he said, it was fantastic, it was great. I will definitely get residence because I went to the interview and I told them that back in Iraq I was a truck driver, and if they just gave me the opportunity, I would become the best truck driver in Greece. I'd earn lots of money, pay lots of taxes, and be an upstanding Greek citizen. Now logically, if you know nothing about asylum law, that makes sense. I asked him, well, okay, well, why did you leave Iraq? And he said, well, because I'm from a persecuted religious minority and a militia murdered my family. And I said, well, did you tell them that? And he said, no, of course not. I don't want them to think that I'm weak, that I'll be a burden, that I'll be problematic for them. And again, half an hour with an asylum lawyer, 10 minutes with an asylum lawyer would have made this person understand that actually what he had done, whilst logical, was the worst possible thing he could have done from an asylum law perspective, because it made him appear like he was an economic migrant and therefore likely to be rejected. In this situation, what we provide is to try and help people to understand their rights, understand the process. We explain asylum as a concept, and then give people individualised advice about their case, which is done in confidential context, one-on-one legal consultation, the same that our lawyers would provide back home in their countries. We provide general advice about the legal procedure and answer questions when people come to our container, and we help people with family reunification under the Dublin regulation to try and reunite families, one of whom is already in one of the European member states. We provide information sessions in the camp to help people understand the basics of the process, and recently we've produced and distributed a legal information leaflet which we translated into 10 languages, and 13,000 copies are currently being distributed, the aim of which again is to help people understand their basic rights. The reason that we do this is, first of all, because providing people with information about their rights and preparation for their interview is the most effective intervention that a lawyer can do, because the interview that people go through, their asylum interview, is the critical interview. Everything that follows, whether it goes to an appeal, to a judicial procedure, whether it ends up at the European Court of Justice, will be based on that initial interview. And that's where people don't receive advice, and so they're where the biggest need is. We also, in a more nebulous way, try to provide a mechanism to give people back some of their dignity, and I was touched by what Bishop Dowling said about this, about the critical importance of human dignity, because the process in Lesvos is a dehumanizing one. People go through the process not as an individual but as a number or a face. And I was struck when Bishop Dowling was talking about me myself standing at the Greek asylum service in the camp and speaking to somebody who said the word that we hate most, that asylum seekers in Moria hate most, is tomorrow. Because every time we come and speak to the authorities, they say, oh, come back tomorrow, come back tomorrow. And 6 months later, they're still coming back tomorrow. What we try and do is to give people back some of their humanity by talking to them as individuals, assisting them with their case, and being someone to listen to their situation to try and help guide them through the process. Since 2016, as I mentioned, we've grown, and we're now the largest provider of legal assistance to asylum seekers on Lesvos. We reach approximately 40% of those in Moria, and on average we assist about 800 people per month. We're also the primary provider of legal assistance to unaccompanied minors who have been incorrectly registered as adults. We've done more than 300 of those cases, and asylum seekers in detention. So far we've welcomed 148 volunteer lawyers from 17 European countries, and in total assisted over 9,100 people. The majority of the nationalities that we assist, it won't surprise you to hear, are from countries like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, including many vulnerable cases, victims of torture, victims of violence, SGBV survivors and minors. And in total, our volunteers have contributed over 37,000 voluntary hours. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank the volunteers, some of whom are here tonight, for their incredible hard work and tenacity and commitment. I have to say, this was, I come from private practice back in the UK, and working in a commercial firm, it's fair to say the reputation of lawyers is not necessarily always so great. And so I was actually incredibly surprised that so many people, more than 600 people, 600 lawyers have applied to volunteer with us. And some volunteers have come multiple times. Some people have come 4 or 5 times. Some people have given up their holiday every year for the last 3 years to come and volunteer in Lesvos. No volunteer has ever missed a day. No volunteer has ever said they'd rather go to the beach than the camp. And actually, the problem has been the opposite. The difficulty, my challenge is, as trying to manage the project, is to actually try and make the volunteers stop working. Maybe understand that Sunday 10 o'clock at night is maybe time to go and have something to eat rather than continue working on the case list. I'd also like to thank the staff. We have 2 Greek lawyers, and we're incredibly fortunate that Christina Arkontaki, our legal coordinator, who's also our very first lawyer, our first volunteer, who volunteers here will know, that is an incredibly hard-working, tenacious and compassionate person with an unflinching commitment to justice and fairness, and Vasilis, who's our other Greek lawyer, who, again, we were incredibly lucky to find someone who shares those same qualities of commitment, compassion and humanity. And also, of course, our interpreters, who arguably actually have the hardest job of all, spending 8 hours a day interpreting back and forth for lawyers, often on extremely difficult and emotionally heavy material. In terms of the value of legal assistance, because of course it's a noble and important thing to talk about rule of law and access to justice and upholding human rights, but in concrete terms, of the people who we've advised and who have informed us of the outcome of their case, 74.5% of them have been granted international protection, compared to the average in Greece of 46.5%. So an almost 30% difference if somebody has spoken to one of our lawyers, or I'm sure any lawyer working on Lesvos. We've helped more than 3,600 people be recognised as vulnerable, meaning they've been able to leave Lesvos and go to to carry on their process on the Greek mainland. And we've helped over 900 people be recognised as eligible to be reunited with their family members in other European countries. I was thinking when preparing this about some of our cases, to try and give an idea of the personal importance of having a lawyer. And I remember one of our early cases was a Nigerian couple, and the lawyer working on it, the volunteer lawyer working on this case, were absolutely convinced that this couple had a case. On the face of it, they didn't. And Nigeria is a low recognition rate country, so in many cases there's only a 4 or 5% chance of success overall. The lawyers were convinced that this couple had a really strong case and had 7 different consultations with them over a kind of 4-week period. And in the end, they were the only 2 out of the group of 51 Nigerians at that point who were actually granted refugee status, meaning that actually they could then be reunited with their children who were back in Nigeria. And I am absolutely certain that without the assistance of the lawyers in that case, they would have been seen simply as another Nigerian case and dismissed accordingly. I was thinking about cases, a case of an Afghan woman who was a survivor of SGBV who could not articulate what happened. She was physically unable to explain what happened, and was in the interview being pressured by the interviewer to say what happened, even though it was quite clear what happened, and it was only through the intervention of our lawyer that she was able to progress through the interview without having to go into explicit details of what had happened. I was thinking about the message that I received from a 17-year-old Syrian boy who recently arrived in Germany after being successfully reunited with his uncle, who was beyond delighted that he had finally got back with his family. And all of these things, these human elements beyond the statistics, are really what is the true value of the work that the lawyers do on Lesvos. Thinking though through the last 3 years, it brought me to today's situation, and looking at it compared to the end of 2015-2016, thinking about now the reaction to the welcoming in 2015 and 16 of refugees when they arrived in Greece, and thinking about the tougher border controls, the externalisation of border controls, the deals with third countries, EU-Turkey deal, the deal between Italy and Libya, the closing of the borders, the political reaction, the losses for Chancellor Merkel in Germany, the rise of the right wing in Italy and Hungary and Germany and many other countries as well. And what struck me most, I suppose, was the lack of media attention, the normalisation of the situation. And actually, in many ways, that's more shocking than seeing the camp with 11,000 people in. It's when you see the camp with 6,000 or 5,000 people in, when there haven't been any arrivals for 2 or 3 months, and realise that that is the new normal in Europe, whereby we are seemingly accepting of a situation where there will be 17,000 people on the Aegean Islands in camps going through a slow asylum process, often without legal assistance, often without other needs being met. I was thinking about the gradual erosion of human rights safeguards and guarantees in the name of procedural efficiency. In particular, I was struck by a case we had about a year ago of a 17-year-old boy from Burkina Faso who was in detention under what's called the low threshold recognition rate project, whereby people from 28 nationalities, if they arrive in Lesvos, can and are put directly into detention to have their procedure done in an expedited way in detention. This boy had arrived, said he was 17, had been assessed as being an adult, and was in detention. He told our lawyer that actually he had been in prison for 12 years of his life. He was born effectively born in prison in Burkina Faso and had stayed there for the majority of his life. Here he was again in Europe, back in detention. And that, I think, dovetails with what Bishop Dowling said in terms of the obligations we have. And when I look at it from the other perspective, from the perspective of the people in the camp, of the refugees in Moria, often they will say that they think that nobody in Europe knows about what's going on in Lesvos, because if they did, they wouldn't let it happen. They can't believe that something like this could be allowed in Europe, and therefore it must be that nobody in Europe knows about it. On many occasions people said we fled to Europe because it's the bastion of human rights, and here we are, and this is not what we expected. This is what we might have expected in other countries, but not in the European Union. And I think that is critical to continue to draw attention to this, and I'm extremely grateful to Pax Christi International for this award, as I mentioned, in order to continue to draw attention to this issue. And within this context, we are looking to expand our operations. We're soon to start a new project on Lesvos, which is about improving people's understanding of their rights, preparing legal leaflets, information sessions, focusing on the marginalised groups, unaccompanied minors, unaccompanied women, asylum seekers in detention, and also looking to expand our operation beyond Lesvos to the other Greek islands, and also potentially Italy and Spain, where these issues are extremely pressing and live as well. And in that context, just to conclude by, I suppose, a plea to people to not forget about the situation on the Aegean Islands, in Greece, in Italy, in Spain. 581 people so far in 2019 have died or are missing as a result of shipwrecks in the Mediterranean. In 2018, 2,277 people died or are missing, and only 2 weeks ago, 7 people, including 2 children, died off the coast of Lesvos, only a couple of miles away from arrival. And indeed, as we speak, in Italy, in Lampedusa, the Sea-Watch ship is trying to land, and yesterday its appeal was rejected, and currently today they're trying to land in Lampedusa to be able to disembark the refugees on that boat. And in this situation, it's critically important to continue bringing attention to the issue, to continue to work to protect human rights and uphold the rule of law, and indeed, I think, to push something that the CCB and the German Bar Association have been pushing themselves over the last couple of years, which is to try and establish independent and individual legal assistance as a standard measure of humanitarian aid, like food, water or shelter, because in almost every single humanitarian situation there is a legal element to it, but that is often neglected and marginalised. And so with that plea, I suppose, I'll conclude my remarks and thank Pax Christi International again for the award, which we're extremely grateful and privileged to have received. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. So this concludes this evening's program. If you are using a headset, please